All right, with that, I have 3:30. Is everybody ready to get started? Okay. For everybody that's joined us, thank you so much for being here for HMSC's Research Summit. My name is Cinnamon Moffett, and I'm the Research Program Manager at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center, located in Newport, Oregon, and I will be your host for today. A couple things logistic-wise, your cameras, mics, and screen shares have been turned off, but we do hope that you ask us questions throughout today's presentation. We will be answering them at the end, but please put them into the chat box at any time. You probably all know by now, but if you would like to use chat, there's a little pop-up box that you can push on that says chat. You type in a question there and we'll be able to answer those at the end. I also wanted to let folks know that we are recording today's event. And I'm going to put that in the chat now on where you'll be able to find that in a few days. So if you are curious about watching this again, or you missed something, or you would like to share it, feel free to do that. And that will be posted in just a few days. One quick announcement, I just wanted to promote next week's seminar, same place, same time, but June 3rd, we're already in June, my goodness. We have Malin Pinsky, who is from the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Natural Resources from Rutgers University, who will be here to talk to us about ecology and evolutionary responses to global changes across realms. So I'm really interested to learn a little bit more about what he has to share with us. So please join us next week for that. If you want to learn about any of the Hatfield events, please Google our homepage at HMSC, scroll to the bottom and you'll find all of the links and information you might need to join us there. I'm also going to do a little plug. I am filling out the summer seminar sessions. So if you or somebody you want to just volunteer would like to give a seminar to the Hatfield community, please reach out to me and I'll work on getting them on the schedule. And thank you all for helping us fill out our summer schedule for a seminar. For today, we have Caren Braby, Maggie Sommers, and Leif Rasmuson from ODF&W's Marine Resources Program, who is going to give the first of a series of talks to us about policy and science of sustainable fisheries in Oregon. But I'm going to hand this off to Bob, who's going to talk to us a little bit more about each of the speakers here. So Bob, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Great. So I want to start out by just saying that Oregon, and especially us here at Hatfield, are, I think, really fortunate to have a state agency with such qualified and committed scientists as we have in ODF&W. And we have 3 of those scientists here today to speak to us and set up a panel and a series of talks that we'll have through the year. So I'm really appreciative of their participation and the fact that we're all neighbors. So the 3 are Caren Braby, who's the Marine Resources Program Manager, Maggie Sommer, who's the Fishery Management Section Leader, and Leif Rasmuson, who is the Marine Fisheries Research Project Leader. Together, they are forming part of the Marine Resources Program. And as Cinnamon said, they're going to be talking today about policy and science for sustainable fisheries in Oregon, and they will set up some of the challenges that they encounter, how they're trying to resolve it, some of the science that's needed, and basically what's needed to sustain healthy marine fisheries for future generations. A little bit about each of them. Caren is, as I said, the manager of Marine Resources Program and a world-renowned joke teller, as we just heard. She and her staff build partnerships with industry, academic researchers, tribal community, federal and state agencies, and stakeholders and elected officials. So if you can put yourself in the context of trying to communicate with that many different people, you certainly will understand one of our goals at Hatfield and the university of experiential training, so that you get a chance to interact with as many of these people before you have to go up and actually try to be the one coordinating them. So I'm very impressed with Karen's ability at this. She serves as the co-chair of Oregon's legislatively creative Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Coordinating Council, and she's also a council member of the Pacific Marine Fisheries Management Council. helping West Coast communities and fisheries develop successful strategies to adapt to and mitigate ocean change. She received her doctorate from Stanford University's Hopkins Marine Station. Any of you hopefully have been there. It's a spectacular location next to Monterey and home to John Steinbeck's Cannery Row. And she's conducted scientific research from estuaries out to deep sea hydrothermal vents. And she got her interest started with wet feet in the intertidal as a very young kid. As the fishery management section leader, Maggie Sommer is responsible for managing the commercial and recreational ocean fisheries associated with Oregon. She's been at ODF&W for 15 years, and she's also headed the Marine Fishery Data Program and statewide conservation planning efforts for our nearshore resources. She has interesting background. She directed science education at a field station in the Bahamas. She's established a fish monitoring program for Marine Reserve in Belize. She was a head chef at a small restaurant in Virginia. And while she was getting her master's program at the MRM program here at Oregon State, so she's a beeve, she was also aquarist for the Hatfield Visitor Center, and she did this during her studies. She also speaks French, I presume, having gotten a bachelor's in French from the University of Virginia. And our third speaker tonight is Leif Rasmussen. Leif's comes from us from the University of Oregon, where he received his PhD in marine biology, studying dispersal and recruitment of Dungeness crab. And then from there, he did a postdoc at the Southeast Fisheries Science Center. I think he actually overlapped while Sue and I were still at UM, or maybe it was just right at the end. And studying larval biology of Atlantic bluefin tuna. He has since then been here working and running the Marine Fisheries Research Project at ODF&W, conducting research on fishery stock assessments and other fishery management needs for Oregon's marine fish invertebrates. So you can see this group of individuals have come with a lot of experience, a lot of training, and they're going to speak to us again today about the policy and science for sustainable fisheries in Oregon. And I'm pleased to turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thanks very much for the introduction, Bob. This is Maggie, and I will kick us off. I'm going to start sharing my screen. And then I'm going to start the slideshow. So hopefully that looks good. Somebody give me a heads up if it doesn't. But
looks good,
thanks
Maggie.
very much. Okay, thanks, Cinnamon. As I said, I'm going to kick us off, and we will all have a turn at it today. As Cinnamon said, this is intended to be the first of a series of seminars, and so this one will be fairly high level, and then we will be really diving into some of the details of this information in follow-up seminars. And one of the things we want to do is hear from you guys today about what you would be interested in hearing from us. But let me just get going. And in fact, I'm going to start right now with an audience participation activity here, which you can do via Zoom. We have included a great big buzzword in the title of this presentation, sustainable fisheries, right? You know, so much emphasis on sustainability now. So we're very interested in your response when you hear sustainable fisheries. What does that mean to you? What do you think of first? So in a second, I will just put up a list of terms here that could apply to sustainable fisheries, and then Cinnamon will pop up a Zoom poll and just pick one. There's no right answer. The responses are anonymous. It doesn't matter. It's going to be tough because like me, I bet you'll probably want to pick them all, but just the one that most closely matches what you're thinking, or something that really reaches out and grabs you. So Cinnamon, if you would put up the Zoom poll, and again, we just want your first gut response. Just pick one, and we'll leave this open for about 20 seconds. No second guessing and changing your answer. Okay, I think we've about settled there. So if you just maybe leave it up for a second there, looks like thriving ecosystem won out over the other choices here, but I'll be very interested in hearing from you all, whether it's today in some discussion after our slide presentations or just in the future, a follow-up on your thoughts on what you might add to this list or what's important to you about sustainable fisheries. So thanks, Cinnamon, if you go ahead and take that down. Or maybe I can. Oh, I can. Thanks. Great. So we'll go on if the slides will advance here. So fishing is great. We're going to start talking about fishing now. It is a tremendously important food source, obviously, source of food, jobs and income, recreation and identity around the world. The statistic at the bottom is from the FAO. It just illustrates the importance of fish as a food source and a protein source for so many people around the world. It's also an incredibly important source of livelihood for so much of the world's population. Bringing it closer to home, here in Oregon, a couple years ago, it was estimated that commercial fisheries supported about 5,800 full-time equivalent jobs. And last year, recreational anglers took just under 200,000 saltwater fishing trips out of Oregon ports. So really a big deal here at home too. It's not all rosy, however. Fishing can have some negative impacts, including overfishing and the other items that are appearing on the right-hand side of the screen. And certainly with the experience and expertise of everyone in the audience here, I bet you guys could add a lot more things to this list. What this really illustrates for me is the fact that fishing means trade-offs between different objectives. And enter the role of policy and management to balance those trade-offs in a way that embodies the values that we as a collective society have, and then how we put those into practice, where the rubber hits the road with fishery management and putting into regulations these things that achieve the balance. Here in Oregon, that happens at several levels. We have the Oregon Fish and Wildlife Commission, which manages fish and wildlife throughout the state, including fisheries in state waters in the ocean from shore to 3 nautical miles, and fisheries that might occur farther out but land into Oregon ports. The commission has 7 members appointed by the governor to represent the public interest of the state. And it adopts policies such as the native fish conservation policy and rules such as bag limits, fishing seasons, or closed areas in state waters, and much more. There's also a level of federal fishery management. We have the Pacific Fishery Management Council on the West Coast, which manages fisheries occurring in federal waters, the U.S. exclusive economic zone from 3 to 200 nautical miles. The Pacific Council is one of 8 regional fishery management councils around the country with responsibility for managing fisheries in federal waters. Here, the Pacific Council has 14 voting members with representatives from Oregon, Washington, California, Idaho, the tribes, and the National Marine Fisheries Service. And it has very active advisory bodies whose membership includes fishermen, conservation interests, and scientists. We also have a very closely coordinated joint management for fisheries that overlap. There are a lot of policies and laws at both state and federal levels that guide fishery management here. I've highlighted the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act, although notably there are others. I mentioned Oregon's Native Fish Conservation Policy, and certainly there are others at the state level. We're also working with the Federal Endangered Species Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, and others. And in general, these all tend to embody those trade-offs I mentioned by requiring both conservation and sustainable use for now and into the future. Fishery management in the United States and in Oregon, here under the Magnuson-Stevens Act and through Oregon leadership, has really led to a lot of successes I want to highlight here. We've rebuilt 47 stocks around the country from an overfished status, and I'll just take a moment to note that overfished here means stock biomass or abundance below a certain threshold for any reason, not necessarily fishing. And that certainly applies to some of our Pacific Northwest salmon stocks, which I think we're all well aware are unfortunately subject to a lot of habitat-related and habitat and water concerns in particular, affecting their stock status. On the West Coast, we've successfully rebuilt 9 out of 10 groundfish stocks that were found to be overfished in the late 90s, early 2000s. The remaining one is our friendly yellow eye rockfish, which is on a rebuilding trajectory, although it's not quite yet up to its target biomass level yet. Notably, no West Coast stocks are currently subject to overfishing. And this is really something that I think highlights our successful management, because this means that they are not being fished at an unsustainable rate. Fished at and that's something that is much more in the control of fishery managers. Here in some of our state managed fisheries, we've seen a big reduction in the bycatch in our pink shrimp trawl fishery based on some regulations adopted following some research and innovative gear modifications developed through collaborative work between our scientists and pink shrimp fishermen. That's what the photo at the bottom illustrates, is just the reduction in finfish in some pink shrimp hauls. And another example is our state derelict gear removal program, which has led to the removal of over 5,000 derelict crab pots from the ocean since the program's beginning. So the last slide talked about some of the conservation successes of fisheries, but there are also a lot of challenges to the sustainability of how fisheries themselves are able to operate. Certainly climate change, climate and ocean change, and the effects that it will have on the distribution and productivity and availability of target species, as well as species like whales that we want to avoid, is a big one. Potential changes to the frequency of harmful algal blooms. There will be competition for ocean space use from things like wind energy and aquaculture, and loss or difficulty in maintaining a lot of the port infrastructure needed to support fishing activities on the West Coast is another big challenge. So this, given the balance and our interest in maintaining sustainable fisheries, these are something we think a lot about as well. And I'm going to conclude my section of the slides here today and just put out for folks to think about some questions that I spend really most of my professional days thinking about. And this is coming back to the core task of fishery management, which is to find a way to meet the multiple and sometimes competing goals by putting limits on catch and on fishing activity. We need a lot of information to make good decisions on what these limits should be, such as the biology and population dynamics of target stocks and of bycatch species. We need to understand ecosystem interactions and ecology, how those might change in the future, habitat use. Importantly, we really need to know what the uncertainty around the answers we think we know are, so that we can apply precautionary buffers as appropriate. There are a zillion more questions, but we get some of the information needed to answer these from our own fishery monitoring programs, like ODFW's dockside commercial and recreational catch sampling programs and the National Marine Fisheries Services observer programs. And we get others from research done by a lot of you on the webinar today, as well as my own colleagues here in ODFW. And so with that, I will turn it over to Leif to talk a little bit more about some ODFW research. And I will stop sharing so you can take on.
Sounds good. Let me get my screen sharing. All right. Hopefully that's displaying for you all.
Yes, looks good.
Perfect. So like Maggie said, management relies on this information, and really, what I'm going to talk about and what I kind of focus on is providing that information to Maggie. And the old adage of garbage in and garbage out really applies here. And I love this cartoon because it says garbage in, data out. And the reality is you can put anything in and I can make it turn into data. Whether or not that data is good and should be used for fisheries management is important. So, really what's important is giving good data and good information to the managers so that the decisions can promote that sustainability going forward. And so when I think of fisheries research, I kind of try and think of it like a course trajectory at a university. I kind of think of these 4 basic areas. We have basic biology of the animals, the population dynamics of the animals, the general fisheries in general, and then the ecology and ecosystem, kind of how that fishery or that animal fits into the big picture. And so what I'm going to do is go through some of the questions we're answering and we have for each of these 4 courses. And to do that, I'm going to show you some cool pictures that'll really be the thing to focus on. And near that, there'll be a little box that'll say kind of the basic goal of that research, the bigger question we're answering, what species we work on, and then who we're collaborating with. Everything I'm going to point out, and I will reiterate it this as I go, is a great spot for future collaboration. And so anything that catches your interest and stuff, reach out to us. We're always looking for collaborators. We love working with other folks on this kind of stuff. So basic biology. Basic biology is an incredibly important part of sustainable fisheries management, but it's really often overlooked. We're not going to manage a salmon the same way we're going to manage a rockfish, but it'd be pretty easy to just look at them and say they're fish, we're going to manage them the same. But we know enough to know from their basic biology that that's not the case. So other things that are really important are the age and growth of fish. How old are the fish we catch? If fish don't live a long time or they live a really long time, we're going to manage things differently. We do this with ground fish and bivalve and shrimp. I have someone who works with me who their entire job is to read otoliths, which you can see on the right there, is a deacon rockfish, to give us that age data to better inform how we manage rockfish. This is one of the most important things that I think from a science standpoint we do. Maturity. How old are the fish when we catch them? And how long? Are they mature at that point or not? Obviously, we probably don't want to be fishing for a fish if it's not reproductively mature at that point. We want to make sure that babies are producing and going into the future. And then validating ages. If you read the original age and growth work that's happened, a common thing that's always listed is we need to be validating our ages. We need to basically ensure that the age we say is actually what the age it is. This is really often overlooked. This little micrograph that I'm showing on the side is some work we're just kicking off. This is a cabezon otolith, and the little tiny dots on the left side are where we're going to shoot the laser, and the bigger spots on the right side are where we did shoot the laser. And so what we're doing is we're looking at the ratio of oxygen isotopes and seeing if they line up with where those lines are to actually tell us how well we're doing at our aging patterns with cabezon. Movement. What types of habitat do animals use and what influences this? Stonewall Bank is a great area for yellow eye. We have it as a yellow eye conservation area. But do the yellow eyes stay there? Does an individual who's at Stonewall stay there, or do they go to a halibut fishing grounds? So movement studies like this are really important to know these things. Otherwise, spatial area management really doesn't inform us all that much. Stock structure. We manage on the concept of stock still. While these stock boundaries are often still are based now on political lines, state lines, international lines, things like that, the idea of stock is still an incredibly central tenet of fisheries management. Here's some great work we did with OSU looking at whether or not deacon rockfish in the offshore and the nearshore represented unique stocks, comparing both a genetic approach and an otolith morphology approach to see if there was that pattern. If we didn't find strong evidence, we proposed, but if we had, that would suggest that the offshore stock should be managed in a different way than nearshore because the fishing effort is wildly different between these two areas. Recruitment. How many of what's coming up? This is something I've been passionate about for many, many years. The work that's done by ODFW and others on pink shrimp is some great cutting edge work that's doing this. If we know what's coming, we can do a better job of managing. That's one of our biggest components of uncertainty in fisheries management is what's coming into the population. This is actually an area that gets quite a bit of research, but a passion of mine is to kind of really reiterate that recruitment in an ecological sense and a recruitment in a fishery sense are often conflated together, but aren't really often answering the same questions. And so I encourage people who are working on recruitment to really think about the differences between those two and how they can make the linkage to make it fit. That's something you're interested in, reach out to me and I'd love to chat more about it. Population dynamics. I'm just going to focus on one thing here. I'm just going to talk about counting animals. You know, how many of them are out there is such an important component of what we do. So on the top left of this screen, there's a great cartoon from our marine reserve showing all the awesome tools that they use to count fish and invertebrates in their marine reserves. The top right shows our shellfish team using a UAV to count clams. The bottom then shows hydroacoustics or fish finder data, which I use to count rockfish. My colleagues use to count herring. And so what you see is there's all this amazing technology that is being used by us. NOAA does this, OSU. We all have these great technologies we're implementing to figure out better ways and more efficient ways to count fish. Because of these technological components of these are really, really great spots for cross-disciplinary collaboration and research. So, you know, if you have ideas on how to build things and work with things, that's great. You can, especially if you can figure out ways to make it efficient and cost effective, that's something that the state and fisheries really need. Looking at fisheries, Maggie kind of touched on this a little bit with shrimp, but you know, a common research focus within research or within fisheries themselves is bycatch reduction. So thinking of bycatch is obviously reducing the catch of non-focal species in that fishery. But conversely, that also means you're increasing the catch of the focal species, which increases efficiency. And increasing your efficiency means the vessel may not need to operate as long. It may mean that the belts or the engine's not running as hard when the net's in the water. All things that actually reduce climate or carbon emissions and have a climate impact. So the effects of bycatch reduction are not just immediately on that fishery, but have long-lasting effects that go forward. This is a great diagram showing us basically the history of bycatch reduction in the pink shrimp fishery. This is a great fishery where a lot of really interesting work has really made it one of the premier fisheries for shrimp in the world to be a really clean and good example of what we can do. Also with that idea of bycatch reduction, ODFW worked with others to design a new net for flatfish. By moving that head rope back, we basically could reduce the number of rockfish and non-focal species there to increase our catch of petrale and Dover sole, things like that. Whale entanglement, a big issue these days. It is effectively bycatch. I mean, it's one organism being caught in another fishery. OSU and ODFW are doing great work to try and mitigate this. The fleet is working together. This is really shows the great aspects of Hatfield and our collaborative nature as we go forward and do this kind of work. Here's another bycatch story. So as Maggie mentioned, the yellow-eye rockfish is our last overfished groundfish in Oregon. We didn't have a lot of sport and recreational fishing out on the shelf because of yellow-eye. ODFW worked and figured out that if we put the hooks far enough off the bottom, we can still access a lot of those midwater stocks for yellowtail and widow rockfish while ignoring or avoiding the yellow-eye rockfish. So it's bycatch reduction, but it's not making a fishery cleaner like we often think when we think about bycatch reduction. It was actually just creating a new fishery by figuring out the bycatch reduction. And the last thing I'll talk about with fisheries is fisheries-induced effects. I struggle with what to say here, so that this one's a little rough. But effectively, barotrauma is a common thing we've all heard of with rockfish. This picture on the lower left shows yellow eye with its eyes popped out of swim bladder. Anybody who's been fishing around here has seen something like this. ODFW has collaborated with a number of folks and done a ton of research looking at how the physiology of these organisms is affected over time after being caught. And then looking at, if we recompress them, how is survival? That gives us what we call survival credits, a really key component of fisheries management. What is the long-term effects? This one slide encompasses tons and tons of research papers and things like that. This has really been a key focal area. And so the last thing I brought up of those 4 courses was the ecology and ecosystem. And so what are the environmental effects? Kind of how do things in the current and future environment affect species distributions? Here's some work we did looking at the movement of deacon rockfish. And so what you see in the left is where the home range of the deacon rockfish were during regular oxygen conditions and hypoxic conditions, and then the vertical movement of the fish during hypoxic. They obviously are having a big change when hypoxia hits. Not only does this affect just the fish and its biology, but it also affects how the fishery is going to operate. And if we're going towards a survey, that population dynamics question, it's going to affect how we go about surveying these fish. And the last thing is ocean acidification. This is, a huge one. That combined with climate change are probably the biggest and most important things we all really are looking at. George Waldbusser and I got a grant to go out on the Oceanus. We went and looked at vertical migration of crab and shrimp larvae. The hypothesis being that in the future, maybe with ocean acidification, crab and shrimp larvae might change their vertical migratory behavior. We're working on finishing this. COVID hit. We were the last ship in the UNOLS fleet out. But if we do find these effects, what we can do is take a biophysical model I've developed. We can change those behaviors and actually see how population dynamics could change going into the future. So climate change, ocean acidification, hypoxia are really huge. They're much bigger than what I'm going on here. So what I'm going to do is pass it off to Caren, and she's going to go into way more about it and educate us way more than I ever could do.
Well, that's a tall order. I'll do my best to share my studies. And I am checking to see that you're seeing my slide.
Yes, we can see you, and go ahead and turn your video back off for us because you're a little jumpy.
All righty, I will do that if I can figure out where my camera just went. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to take a big step back again and get back out of the specific examples that Leif pulled us through to throw the wrench in this whole system. And Maggie alluded to this and described this to some extent at the beginning. We have essentially built a lot of system around understanding fisheries species, fisheries activities, ecosystem that informs our fisheries management. And so you might actually say that, if I can get my slide to change, that sustainable fisheries really are institutionalized in our system. We have federal laws like the MSA, we have conservation federal laws like the NMPA and the ESA that Maggie mentioned, the NEPA laws, lots of federal acts that have put protections in place. We've spent decades of work protecting the ecosystem in a number of ways. And sustainable fisheries is right there with it. But the wrench, of course, is the fact that the ecosystem is not static. The ecosystem is incredibly dynamic, and we are appreciating that dynamism more and more every year. And we have to respond to that. Our fisheries management, as much as we've invested into it, can't stay static because the ecosystem is not static. And so we continue to look for ways to make it able to respond to the ecosystem changes that we're seeing. So the big question that keeps me up at nights and that we are trying to build into our management now is, how do we build sustainable management, which is a long-standing goal of ours, but how do we build flexibility into that system due to the dynamism that we're seeing in ocean and climate change? And as we've hammered home already, and I'll continue to, that question requires information, and that's what leads us to the rich number of collaborations we've had with many of you who are on this webinar, as well as many others. We're interested in understanding ecosystem change and physical trends in the environment so that we understand what those are and how those connect with species we're interested in. We're interested in biological trends, particularly in food webs and sustainability, stability and function of those food webs. And we're interested in other activities that humans are engaged in outside of fisheries that are having impacts on the ecosystem. Very prominent in policy discussions right now is potential development of offshore wind and how that might interact with the ecosystem. But we've had a number of different types of human activities that have generated really rich discussions in the past decades. But it's not just ecosystem changes, it's
impacts to specific species and understanding how the trends that we're seeing in the ecosystem are affecting productivity. Distribution is very key because fisheries management in particular is very spatially locked in. Behavior of species and how that affects their accessibility to fishing gear. Public health concerns as we see the rise, frequency and intensity of harmful algal blooms, how that affects species that we're harvesting and our ability to keep those moving through the seafood markets. And then on the socioeconomic side, there's a lot of uncertainty in the seafood industry itself in terms of what the future holds for that group of folks as a business prospect, and access to fishing grounds as one of them. Again, the policy discussion of the day is offshore wind development and what that means for access to fishing grounds. But there are many other ways that that access may be limited, some of which are from humans establishing boundaries in the ocean. The profitability of harvesting seafood was really challenged and upended in the last year during COVID, when we found that, we couldn't keep fillet lines going at the processing plants because we couldn't keep people close to each other, or there were COVID outbreaks and the seafood markets were shut down because of trade influences. Those kinds of changes that we learned so much about in the last year are the types of disturbances that we anticipate from climate emergencies, ocean change emergencies in the future. And so understanding more about how we can respond to those events is really important as managers for us to try and support that activity. And Maggie already mentioned port infrastructure. So I'm hoping that going through this list, you are thinking to yourself, how can I hook into that? How can I fit myself into that if you haven't already, as a researcher, as a person who's interested in fisheries and interested in the ocean. The Pacific Fisheries Management Council is one place where there are federal initiatives to try and understand the impacts from climate and ocean change on fisheries and fit that into management and respond. The PFMC is set up around fishery management plans. There are 4 that are species-based plans: groundfish, salmon, coastal pelagic species, and highly migratory species. We also have a fisheries ecosystem plan, or FEP, and that FEP has been more initiative-based, so special projects that go on for a year or 2 or a few years, and is about 10 years old now. I'm actually forgetting the first year it was put in place, which is embarrassing, but so be it. FEP initiatives of late, there are 2 in particular I wanted to call out. One was an early initiative on ocean indicators, and that has generated what we now rely on an annual basis as the California Current Ecosystem Report. And what started out as a fairly modest, brief endeavor informing the PFMC on, what's happened in the last year in the ecosystem, just as a general update from our federal researchers and partners, has become a really important landmark effort every single year. And essentially, as soon as each California Current Ecosystem Report is completed in March, planning for the next one begins, and analysis begins for the subsequent one. If you're interested in these and you haven't seen them yet, you can look at any March agenda item for the PFMC and find a copy of that report and see the incredible work that's been done on summarizing different aspects of the ecosystem for the previous year. Another initiative under the Fishery Ecosystem Plan is actually still in progress. It's called the Climate and Communities Initiative, or the CCI. Several of you on the phone or in the webinar have participated in different workshops held under this initiative over the last 2 or 3 years. And although it had a multitude of components to it, the bulk of the work was around scenario planning and trying to envision potential futures for fisheries in about the year 2040, so about 20 years in advance, and thinking about what those conditions might look like and how fisheries might be challenged to respond to those. The workshops and meetings for this scenario planning, like I said, have happened over the last 2 or 3 years, and there is just a wealth of information that's been collected throughout those workshops that is rich for data mining. We are doing our best to at least skim the surface and the rich discussions that occurred, but there is a lot to learn from those workshops and should be something that we dig into more over the coming years. One of the themes that started off the Climate and Communities Initiative was the need to have management flexibility and recognizing that as a barrier to fisheries being able to respond to climate and ocean change. And just as a little preview of what the scenario planning looks like, this is a result of the scenario planning, these 4 different scenarios: Fortune and Favor, Blue Revolution, Box of Chocolates, and Hollowed Out. And I'll just leave those titles there as a tickler and encourage you to learn more about that. So I've shared that the federal side of fisheries management on the West Coast is starting to explore this, trying to envision how we can change management, make it more flexible in response to climate and ocean change. Again, with that caveat that we've spent a lot of time building a lot of infrastructure to make sure that fisheries are sustainable. And part of flexibility is questioning some of that rigidity and figuring out what parts of it we can make more flexible. And that's a real challenge. On the state side, our Fish and Wildlife Commission has just last year adopted the Climate and Ocean Change Policy, which is the first of its kind in the nation for a fish and wildlife agency. So we're pretty proud that they have embraced the need to both acknowledge and deal with the impacts of climate and ocean change on our ability to manage resources. It's a science and principles-based policy, so it is not prescriptive. Instead, the intent is to set up the framework for future decision-making. So anytime we bring a regulation change to the commission, part of our requirement under this policy is to describe the connections of that new regulation to climate and ocean change and provide that context, particularly if it was integral to the staff recommendation that we're bringing to the commission. So really the initiatives that we bring or that we will engage in are fishery by fishery evaluation and potential regulations or non-regulatory changes that we make just administratively in how we run our program and how we run our fisheries outside of regulations. I'll highlight a couple of species. Pink shrimp has already been mentioned twice. It is one of our most important in terms of volume and price, state-run fisheries. So I'm differentiating between federal fisheries under PFMC and state fisheries under primarily ODFW jurisdiction. The pink shrimp fishery has a number of components that have been built in to make it sustainable and make it responsive to ocean change. Pink shrimp population responds to ocean conditions, and so we've built in a limit reference point to make sure that we don't see harvest go beyond what we understand to be a sustainable level. And then we've already seen the incredible pictures of removal of eulachon bycatch, eulachon being the silver finfish smelt that has been reduced through bycatch reduction devices and LED lights. This is just a real success story on sustainable, clean in terms of single species fishing. A not so happy story relates to climate change is one about the red abalone, which on our south coast is at the tip of the northern range of this species. And after the West Coast was faced with the marine heat wave, the blob, we saw widespread progressive loss of kelp. And then we've been observing ramification after ramification, including declining abalone populations, bursts of urchin populations, kelp barrens, urchin barrens, and in concert with our management partners in California, took steps to close the remaining fishery on this species, the sport fishery, across both California and Oregon. And this is still closed. The positive side of this is that we have really come together to do some good evaluation of the species and are thinking about ways to really dig into this and trying to get grant funding to do this even more. Another positive story in terms of climate impacts on fisheries is around Dungeness crab. Similar to pink shrimp, we've built a limit reference point into that species management. And so any response of the species, the recruitment and so on to ocean conditions has a threshold that we can compare the population to. And so as if populations get too low, we have management actions that we can engage. But more on more of an annual basis, we're actively working with industry and conservation and other sister agencies on two really important aspects of climate response or ocean change response. One is around biotoxins, which has come from this increased frequency and intensity of harmful algal blooms over the last 6 or so years. And then whale entanglement risk, which also has been elevated over about the same period of time. So these last two species, red abalone and Dungeness crab, we're just seeing incredible ecosystem response from the marine heat wave, the blob, and years of response and ripple effect in these fisheries. So with biotoxins, the success is that we've established ways to maintain seafood traceability and continue harvest with evisceration to remove the biotoxin and protect with those systems public health in the process. And so this is an economic and public health success story, both responding to biotoxins. I think this audience knows a lot about whale entanglement risk reduction, but I'll just say, I'll repeat that our partnership with Oregon State University, Oregon Sea Grant, the US Coast Guard, the Crab Commission, and others has been really important to establish research projects and management response to try and get a handle on this elevated whale entanglement issue. So I'll move on from there. And where this thought process really got me when I was preparing for this opportunity was, man, that's a lot of work. That's a lot of work at the federal level. That's a lot of work at the state level. Why are we going through all of this effort to save fisheries? And it's somewhat of a rhetorical question, and I certainly haven't answered it well in this slide. But I'll give you a couple of answers that occurred to me that may stimulate some thought. So in reverse countdown, not exactly in priority order, but somewhat. First of all, we have to save fisheries because there are mandates that we do so. That's part of our responsibility to the state of Oregon and to the nation that we protect these activities. But that's not a really compelling reason. Another is that it's part of our cultural identity. And here in Oregon, fishing has been part of our culture as white settlers in this area since we've been here, but to tribal governments for many centuries prior to that as well. So having a healthy ecosystem and the ability to harvest seafood is a very deep part of our cultural identity. Also exemplified by COVID and our experience through that has been food security. It is important to have local sources of food. Even in today's society, there are times when we need food security. We need to know how to get food and put it on the table. A little more nuanced is that we want fisheries because it really enriches our economic viability, particularly for coastal areas, but really for the state as a whole as well. And then my favorite reason is that fishing related and fishermen's knowledge is absolutely invaluable to our understanding of the ocean, which is, as this says, 70% of Earth's surface. And without those daily trips to sea, without the passion for the ocean to learn about it and understand it, we as scientists, I'm a scientist, I can't get out on the water as often. I can't observe that, and I cannot experience that in the way that fishing related activities, whether it's research or fishing trips and fishermen's knowledge, can contribute. And we don't want to lose that. So here we get to the end of my section and another polling question. And really the message we wanted to share today was our perspectives on sustainable fisheries, which have different definitions probably for each of us, all, not just the three of us, but those of you listening as well. But we all want sustainable fisheries. And to do that, to both define that and to achieve that and improve it, we need you. And so we thought that bringing case studies to dig more into the details would be a really interesting way to participate in the HMSC seminar series. So Cinnamon's going to put up a poll and highlight these fisheries. You can pick your favorite. You can put others in the chat. That will all be of interest. And this really does, in the next 20 seconds while you're picking your fishery, this concludes the seminar part, and we're hoping that you all will help us have some discussion about sustainable fisheries. So thank you. Do your poll, and we'll wrap up.
Thanks, Caren. I just wanted to reiterate that somebody pointed out during the earlier poll that not everybody can see the poll. So if you would like to put in your fishery that you want to hear more about into the chat, please do so. I also want to let folks know that the pop-up box that you see on your screen, you'll need to scroll down if you want to see the other fisheries, because there are a few more that you can't see from the box that you see now. All right, one more second here, and I'm going to close the poll, and I'll share the results.
And thanks to Leif for putting in that list. Maybe I stopped sharing that slide too quickly.
All right, so the results are up, Caren. Can you can't see
them. I'm one of the ones who can't see the poll.
All right.
What does it say?
Me neither.
You want to jump in there, Leif?
I can't see it either, I was saying.
All right, so what we're seeing as a result, let me see, highly migratory is coming up as our number one interest. Groundfish is our number two. Squid is our number three. Close behind is Dungeness crab, but literally every one of them has some interest in it. So I will save this information for you all so you can see it once we're out of Zoom. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing the results here. And we can jump into question and answer. So for folks that have questions, I strongly encourage you to put them into the chat so we can work through them together in our last few minutes. And while we wait for folks to kind of think through, because I know that that was a really high level and a lot of information that was shared with us. Maggie, can you talk a little bit about the plan for the follow-ups to this seminar series, kind of our thoughts and what we're thinking?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, Cinnamon. We are thinking probably about having 2 to 3 more. I don't think we've landed on a number. Wanted to gauge how much interest there was from the audience today, as well as what fisheries you wanted to hear about. So your poll responses and any other input you want to give to us is very helpful on that. But we thought that we might spread them out and have, for example, 1 per term for the next series of several OSU terms. Possibly skipping the summer. We know it's kind of a different goings on here at Hatfield in the summer, and it's a busy time, I think, for a lot of us as well, because as we really start to get into presentations that are focused on fisheries with a lot of detail about those, we'll be pulling in a lot of our scientists and other fishery folks who are often out in the field and busy during the summer. So I think that was our thoughts. I invite Caren or Leif or Cinnamon to add anything that we have talked about that I haven't covered there that would be of interest to folks now.
I would just say that if you are interested in learning more and continuing this conversation, just kind of keep an eye on when we'll send them out. But yeah, we were thinking about every couple, 1 a term or so, depending on how folks feel about that. Okay, and so again, if you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in. I had a question for Caren. We talked a lot about collaboration with doing research. So Leif was talking about that. And then you kind of talked a little bit about flexibility around management. Can you talk about how that works with a state agency within a federal, within a regional kind of management structure? In 2 minutes or less.
It happens very carefully. and so I was careful to differentiate between federal fisheries, which have a much more rigid system from state fisheries. And, in some ways that might be viewed as state fisheries being good. Others might say, well, the federal system is better because there's more rigidity, there's more controls in place. And it really just depends on your frame of reference, whether the rigidity is what you're seeking in management to kind of control bad activity, or if you're looking for flexibility to encourage a certain type of activity. And climate change is making us go back and forth between, the ideal of rigidity around preventing bad behavior. That's why we have laws for anything, including fisheries management, and wanting to have the flexibility to respond to this dynamic environment. So in the case of responding to climate and ocean change, because of the history, the state system is more flexible. And so we have an opportunity to have more flexibility with state managed species because there isn't the long history of all of the regulations, big acts, the Magnuson-Stevens Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act. These are big pieces of legislation that are very difficult, very rigid, and very prescriptive. Which is a good thing in some situations, but in this case, being responsive, being nimble, being flexible, it's not. And so things like the Dungeness crab fishery and the pink shrimp fishery, which are state-run fisheries, we have much more flexibility to try and build in that responsive system than we might in some of the other fisheries. Maggie, do you add anything to that?
No, I think you covered it. Thanks.
And again, we can dig into these as we progress with the series if that is something we want to talk more about. I got a question asking for more details about the exact fisheries, and so I can't see them anymore because I've turned off the poll, but I will share that out with the ODFW folks as we progress. Another question that came in is, how is the long-term outlook for funding for these types of important programs looking?
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that. Funding for the work that we do on fisheries is stable, but it's not increasing at the rate of interest in us producing more work. And so I would say that it's a high priority to at least maintain what we're doing. But when we start talking about new initiatives and adding to what we're doing, it really becomes a challenge, and it becomes a situation where we need to drop other activities in order to accommodate new ones if we can. And so that's a constant balance for us, trying to figure out how to reduce the funding needs for previous priorities and focus that funding on new priorities.
Okay, questions are coming in fast and I'll try to keep up with them. But folks, if we don't get to them, please let me know and we'll try to push your questions out, and the team here can answer them outside of seminar. So can we talk a little bit about how you talk to the public around sustainable fisheries issues? I mean, this was pretty complex even for this audience. So just what are your thoughts along that line?
Yeah, I'll start with that one. It's a big priority for us. It's something that, we think that we have not done a lot of outreach and communication about our work in the past. I will say this seminar to a pretty limited audience here, to some degree, we're kind of preaching to the choir who already have some level of knowledge about these things. But this is one example of us, putting our toes in the water there. We do some other work on that. We do some social media posting about sustainable fishery issues. We have done a podcast talking about sustainable fisheries. I would say other than that, it has been relatively low key in person and pretty limited in scope. And we are really working on trying to increase our reach there. So trying to develop a lot of information that we could share, in some form or another on our website. There are some materials there now, but also just looking for opportunities where we can, reach out and talk to people about these events, et cetera. So I guess one of the things I would do is turn that back to this audience and invite you to let us know if you have ideas or opportunities that you're aware of that would be good ways to get information out to the public. Please do. We'd love to hear it.
Okay, and then I'm going to ask one more question. I know we're running over, so if anybody needs to leave, feel free to do so. But Caren, you mentioned the importance of fisher knowledge. What, if anything, is being done to better incorporate fishermen's knowledge into fisheries management practices?
Yeah, that's a great question. And ODFW, the Marine program in particular, really puts a lot of effort into meeting with our harvesters throughout the season and year after year. And so for each fishery, we have different ways of engaging with our fishermen to learn from them, both what they want from their fishery, how the fishery is working, but then also what they're observing and their ideas for how we can do things better, more sustainably. And so whether it's the commercial Dungeness crab industry or it's a group of sport groundfish fishermen, we have different ways of engaging with them to learn from them. That's meeting based. It's, one-on-one, getting on the phone and talking to people, going to port meetings, things like that. There are ways that we have reached out more broadly. We've played around and gotten pretty good at doing surveys so that we can reach people more broadly, even if they can't come to a public meeting. But I'm starting to get some focus on trying to, build some more formal tools where we can build communication channels between fishermen and managers and scientists on a regular basis so that we can kind of have that communication flow just more often, maybe not real time, maybe not every day, but more often than the times that we sit down to have a meeting about something.
Thank you. And thank you all for being with us today. For everybody online, again, I hope you join us for our follow-up sessions around this topic. And I invite you back next week, same time, same place, to learn a little bit more from our guest speaker from Rutgers next week. But again, for our presenters today, thank you so much for your time. I know that that was a huge amount of effort to pull all those things together into just a talk that was kind of clustered into an hour. So I thank you. You're getting lots of applause and Zoom thank yous coming into me right now. So just passing that along. People are clapping and doing all that great stuff. So for those online, thank you so much for joining us. And for our speakers, thanks so much for being here today. I appreciate it. All right, until next time, thanks everybody.